Imagine living in a Rome that dominated nearly the entire known world, a civilization where power and glory were the fuel of human ambition. And among all the powerful men of that age, one name stood out not for his victories in battle, but for his unimaginable Marcus Licinius Crassus. He wasn't just rich. He was the richest man and owner of vast estates, silver mines, slave trading companies, and entire neighborhoods of property within the city itself. People said that if one wanted to know how much gold existed in Rome, one only had to count what was in Crassus's. But despite all that wealth, there was one thing money could not buy: respect. While his peers in power, Julius Caesar and Pompey the Great, filled the chronicles with military triumphs and conquests, Crassus was seen merely as a banker, a dealer of influence, a man who purchased his place at the table of the great. And for a Roman, that was a mortal wound to pride. Rome was a society that worshipped generals, not finance. True prestige didn't come from gold, but from blood and victory on the battlefield. Crassus knew this, and as he grew older, the thought of dying without a military achievement worthy of his name began to torment him. At 60, when most men would have been content with a life of luxury, he decided to risk everything: his fortune, his reputation, and even his life, in pursuit of the glory he so envied in others. And thus was born one of the most disastrous decisions in Roman history: the invasion of Parthia. The region of Parthia, located in what is now Iran, was a vast, powerful, and immensely wealthy empire. Its trade routes controlled the flow of silk and spices between east and west, the kind of wealth that made Crassus's eyes gleam. For him, conquering Parthia would be the ultimate triumph. It would make him even richer and, above all, prove that he was more than just a man of money, that he was a conqueror worthy of Caesar and Pompey. The problem was that Crassus left prudence at home and took only his pride. The Roman Senate, suspicious of his ambitions and well aware of the risks, refused to authorize the campaign. But Crassus, driven by vanity, ignored the law and went anyway, convinced that victory would be swift and easy. After all, how many nations had ever resisted the might of Rome's legions? He believed that merely marching with his 7 legions, around 40,000 soldiers, would be enough to make the Parthians bow before the greatness of Rome. But gold, contrary to what Crassus imagined, cannot buy wisdom. Even with experienced generals by his side, men who knew the desert and the enemy's tactics, he dismissed their advice. He ignored local guides, underestimated the Parthian army, and believed that his financial power could solve any problem. But the Mesopotamian desert does not bow to gold. The Parthians were masters of mobile warfare, skilled horse archers, and heavily armored cavalry who ruled the open plains like ghosts. Crassus, trapped in the arrogance typical of the powerful, believed his disciplined legions would be invincible. And so, in 53 BC, he crossed the Euphrates River, beginning a campaign that would forever change his life and the fate of... At first, everything seemed to go well. Villages surrendered, cities fell easily, and the generals confident. But what he didn't know was that each victory was part of a carefully woven trap set by the brilliant young Parthian commander Cyrene. Little by little, the Roman army was lured deeper into the desert, farther from water, from supplies, and from safety. The scorching sun, the flat, shelterless terrain, and the eerie silence of the sands began to eat away at the soldiers' morale. And as they advanced, the promised glory began to turn into despair. The gold that had sustained Crassus's life now meant nothing. The desert cannot be bought, thirst cannot be bargained with, and glory cannot be financed. What followed would become one of the greatest military disasters in the history of Rome, a bitter lesson on the true cost of vanity and unrestrained ambition. Under the merciless sun of Mesopotamia, Marcus Licinius Crassus believed he was on the verge of achieving the glory he had always longed for. Surrounded by his generals and confident in his wealth, he marched at the head of one of the largest armies Rome had ever sent eastward. 40,000 soldiers, 7 full legions, supported by cavalry and light infantry. It was a spectacle of discipline, strength, and arrogance. Crassus, the richest man in the Republic, saw in this campaign the path to carve his name among the greatest conquerors of history. But there was one fatal problem. He refused to listen to anyone. Since arriving in Syria, ruling with the arrogance of a man who believed gold could buy wisdom, Crassus ignored every warning from his local men who knew the land, who understood the cunning of the Parthians and the dangers of the desert, were dismissed as cowards. Rome has never lost to barbarian. Parthia will be no exception. It was a mistake that would cost him everything. While his officers pleaded for caution, Crassus was seduced by false intelligence brought by paid deserters, lies carefully planted to lure him into ruin. They claimed the Parthian king was in disarray, his army weak and divided. In truth, on the other side of the dunes, a brilliant trap was being set by one of the greatest strategists of the ancient, General Cyrene. Young, charismatic, and audacious, Cyrene knew he could never defeat Rome in open battle, so he chose the battlefield where he would be invincible. the desert. As the legions advanced, the heat grew unbearable, the sand burned beneath their sandals, and the supplies began to dwindle. Long columns of Roman soldiers stretched across the horizon like a weary serpent under a blazing sky. Day after day, the Parthians appeared in the distance, only to vanish again. No one knew when or where they would strike. That uncertainty corroded morale and unsettled even the most seasoned veteran. It was then that Crassus began to realize he had entered a game he did not understand. Parthia did not fight like the enemies Rome was used to. They didn't dig trenches, didn't wait for hand-to-hand combat, didn't accept the honorable clash of blades. The Parthians were phantoms on horseback, moving with breathtaking speed, their composite bows capable of striking from impossible distance. Each time the Romans tried to engage, the Parthians retreated, just beyond reach, while raining down arrows without pause. It was a deadly dance. The Roman shield, designed to block spears and swords, was useless against the unending hail of arrows descending from every direction. Formations began to falter. Panic spread. The thunder of hooves, the twang of bowstring, the cries of the wounded merged into a hellish symphony across the sand. And while the sun scorched the earth, Crassus finally realized that each step forward only led him deeper into the trap. The Parthians commanded everything: the terrain, the timing, the rhythm of battle. Their horsemen knew where water could be found, where to hide, where to strike. They dictated when to appear and when to vanish. Exhausted and parched, the legions began to lose their famed Roman discipline. Soldiers grumbled, officers questioned their orders, and whispers of despair spread through the camp. Still, Crassus would not retreat. Too proud to admit defeat, he clung to the belief that one decisive blow would turn the tide. But the desert does not forgive arrogance. With every arrow that hissed through the air, Roman confidence withered a little more. Publius, Crassus's son, tried to rally the men, reminding them of Rome's honor and pride. But it was already too late. The war they had expected to win with glory had become a nightmare of dust and blood. The gold that once glittered on their standards was now meaningless for thirst and fear. The desert, vast and indifferent, watched as a miniature empire collapsed upon itself, led by a man blinded by vanity. Crassus's mistake was not merely strategic. It was human. He believed that wealth made him wise, that power made him invincible, and that glory was just another prize to be. But in that harsh and pitiless land, Rome found not victory, but its greatest humiliation. The sun rose over the desert of Carrhae when Marcus Licinius Crassus believed for a brief moment that fate was finally smiling upon him. After weeks of uncertainty and ambushes, he had before him what he desired most: an open battle. For a Roman general, this was the ideal scenario, the moment to prove that the discipline of the legions could defeat any enemy. He looked around and saw 40,000 men in formation, shields aligned, spears raised, banners fluttering in the wind, a spectacle of power that made any Roman heart beat fast. But what Crassus did not know was that, at that very moment, the Parthian general Serena was watching everything with a restrained smile. Young, elegant, and shrewd, Serena was the opposite of Crassus in almost every way. While the Roman believed in brute force and personal glory, the Parthian trusted intelligence and time. He had prepared that battlefield like a chessboard, and every move of his enemy was piece placed exactly where he was. Serena's plan was simple and deadly: to use Roman arrogance again. When the first signal was given, the Parthian archers advanced like a swarm, and from a safe distance began the bombardment. Arrows flew in endless waves, whistling through the air and falling upon the legions like rain made of iron. The Roman shields, built to withstand spears and swords, were useless against this storm. The soldiers crouched, raised their shields above their heads, and waited. But the rain did not stop. Serena had planned everything with precision. He had brought with him thousands of camels loaded with reserves of arrows, ensuring that his archers would never run out of ammunition. Each time an archer tired, another took his place. It was a war of attrition, a slow and constant torture. With each passing hour, more and more Romans fell without even seeing the enemy's face. Crassus believed that this was only the beginning, a prelude before the real hand-to-hand combat. He ordered his son's cavalry, led by Publius, to charge and break through the archers' line. Publius, young and brave, rode ahead of 1,000 Gallic horsemen and shouted to his men, "For Rome." It was a heroic moment, but also the beginning of the end. Serena had expected exactly. When the Romans advanced, the archers retreated in perfect order, feigning panic. It looked as though they were fleeing, and Publius believed he had won. "They're running," he shouted, urging his men to pursue them. But it was a trap. The Parthians withdrew only to lure them farther and farther from the main army. When Publius realized it, he was already surrounded. From all sides came horsemen clad in shining metal, the feared cataphract. They were almost mythic warriors, covered in armor that gleamed under the sun, mounted on horses also protected by plates of steel. With long lances and crushing force, they charged against the exhausted and isolated Romans. The impact was devastating. Dust rose, the sound of arrows mingled with screams, and the snapping of bones and shattering shields. Publius fought bravely, wounded and bleeding, but he did not retreat. When he fell, surrounded by enemies, he chose to take his own life rather than be captured. Sharina, however, wanted more than victory. He wanted to humiliate Rome. He ordered the young commander to be beheaded and his head fixed on a spear. Then he commanded that it be carried back to the main camp, where Crassus was still trying to reorganize the legion. Imagine the scene. On the horizon, the Roman soldiers see something gleaming and suddenly realize it is the head of their general's son, the same young man who had left only hours earlier full of hope. The silence that followed was absolute. Crassus fell to his knees, speechless, and the army's morale shattered at that moment. No commander can continue to fight when his own son's body is turned into a trophy of war. From that point on, everything unraveled. The legions began to retreat, disorganized, while the Parthians surrounded and attacked from all sides. Arrows fell like rain, and every attempt to advance led to more casualties. The desert became a graveyard of Roman armor and banners. Crassus, who had set out in search of glory, was now fighting only to survive. What had once been a feared army had turned into a desperate crowd. Sharina, impassive, watched from a distance, like an artist admiring his masterpiece. He had not merely won a battle, he had destroyed a legend. And it was there in Corre, beneath the blazing sun and swirling dust, that the richest man in Rome began to lose everything: his army, his prestige, and finally his hope. The glory he had sought so desperately was buried beneath the sand. The sun of Carrhae set, painting the desert red, and it seemed like an omen. What had begun as a campaign for glory had turned into a never-ending nightmare. The Roman legions, once marching with pride and discipline, were now unrecognizable, exhausted, starving, dehydrated, covered in dust and blood. The air reeked of defeat and despair. The silence that followed the battle was broken only by the groans of the wounded and the scraping of armor dragged across the ground. Marcus Licinius Crassus, the richest man in Rome, saw before him the collapse of the miniature empire he had brought with him. His army, once a symbol of Roman strength, now slipped through his fingers like sand. The defeat at Carrhae was not just military, it was psychological. The soldiers, once bound by iron discipline, had completely lost faith in their commander. No shout, no order was obeyed anymore. The name of Crassus, which once inspired respect, now provoked only anger and fear. Many blamed him for the tragedy. Others, gripped by panic, believed they were cursed. Night fell, and the desert turned cold. The survivors tried to regroup, but confusion reigned. Lines of communication were lost, banners abandoned, and no one knew who was still alive. Some tried to carry the wounded, others wandered aimlessly, guided only by the instinct of. Crassus gathered his officers and, with a trembling voice, announced the inevitable. They would retreat. But retreat, here, did not mean an organized withdrawal. It meant running. The road back to Syria was long, barren, and treacherous. Supplies were nearly gone, and the last drops of water were vanishing. To make matters worse, the Parthians gave no respite. Throughout the night, the hills around them seemed to burn. Lights flickered in the distance. Spears glinted under the moon. The enemy was everywhere. They didn't need to attack head-on. All they had to do was wait. The desert would finish the job for them. As the hours passed, chaos spread. The legions, once trained to march in perfect formation, now dissolved into small, desperate groups, each trying to survive on its own. Many threw away their weapons to carry empty water flasks, begging for a drop to. Others collapsed on the sand and never rose again. The battlefield that had once been the stage of epic valor was now covered by the bodies of those who had died without glory. The sun rose again, merciless, scorching the armor and turning the air into fire. With each step, the soldiers felt the weight of despair pressing down on them. Parched tongues, cracked lips, blurred eyes. Some began to hallucinate, seeing mirages of rivers and fountains. The officers tried to keep order, but it was useless. The most powerful army in the world was dissolving before its own eyes. The Parthians watched from afar, like hunters following the agony of a wounded prey. There was no need to hurry. From time to time, they launched quick attacks, small ambushes that killed a few and vanished into nothingness. It was enough to spread more terror. Retreat had turned into a deadly race. Those who tried to help the wounded were left behind, while the stronger ones pushed their comrades aside in desperation to reach the next patch of shade. The heat was so intense that the spears burned to the touch and sandals melted into the hot sand. Crassus walked amid that hell, surrounded by officers who no longer believed in any. The defeat had broken his spirit. The man who had left Syria with promises of wealth and glory could now barely stand. The gold, the very symbol of his power, seemed to. No coin could buy a sip of water. No title could save what was left of his arm. Every step was a reminder that ambition carries a price, and he was paying the highest of all. By dusk, the survivors reached a rocky area and tried to take shelter among the ruins of a small village. Their hope was to reorganize and perhaps negotiate a truce. But the whispers in the night brought dreadful news. Sharena, the Parthian general, had surrounded the entire area. There was no escape. The legions, the pride of Rome, were now trapped, starving, and demoralized. The desert that Crassus had believed he could cross as a conqueror had become a prison without walls. With every passing hour, more men died, some from thirst, others struck down by invisible arrows flying from the dune. It was in this scene of absolute despair that the fate of Crassus was sealed. He had lost his army, his respect, and above all, his faith. The dream of conquering Parthia ended there, under the weight of and shame. All that remained was to survive, or perhaps to die trying. The desert had fallen silent. The Roman army was destroyed, the fields covered with broken armor and bodies that the wind had already begun to bury in the sand. Marcus Licinius Crassus, once the richest man in Rome, was now only a shadow. His clothes were torn, his face streaked with dust and tears, and his eyes lost somewhere between shame and despair. The commander who had dreamed of conquering Parthia now found himself surrounded, defeated, and without escape. As the sun began to rise over the dunes of Carrhae, bringing with it suffocating heat, a white flag appeared in the distance. It was the signal of Sharena, the Parthian general, who had turned the desert into a Roman graveyard. He sent a message to Crassus, a proposal for peace. The word was that the Parthian king was willing to negotiate, to allow the survivors to return to Rome, as long as the commander came in person to discuss the terms. After so many days of suffering, the idea of an agreement sounded like a miracle. Crassus's officers exchanged uneasy glances. Many saw it as an obvious trap. But the general, broken inside and desperately wishing to end the nightmare, accepted. Perhaps he could still save what remained. Perhaps there was some honor left in acknowledging. And so, on a silent morning, Crassus mounted his horse and rode to meet Sharena, accompanied by a small group of officers. The desert felt more hostile than ever. The wind blew hot, raising clouds of sand that blinded the eyes and made the air hard to breathe. In the distance, the Parthian escort waited motionless, gleaming under the sun like statues of metal. As they approached, Crassus dismounted with what dignity he still possessed and extended his hand in a gesture of truce. Sharena received him with a cold, overly polite smile, too courteous to be sincere. He spoke calmly, promising peace and safe passage. He said he respected Rome, that he admired the power of its legion, and that he merely wished to avoid further bloodshed. Crassus wanted to believe him, but his men saw in the Parthian general's eyes something different, a restrained irony, a disguised pleasure. When the two moved closer to seal the supposed agreement, a Parthian soldier moved quickly. Crassus's horse was pulled away, and in an instant, he was surrounded. His officers tried to react, but were quickly restrained. The white flag fell to the sand, and silence was replaced by shouts and Crassus, the conqueror of Rome, had been deceived, and was now a prisoner of the enemy he had so arrogantly underestimated. Taken to the Parthian camp, he was presented before Sharena, no longer as an equal, but as a trophy. The general observed him with curiosity, almost with pity, and said, "Man of Rome, you came seeking gold and glory. You found only gold and shame." The fate of Crassus was sealed. To the Parthians, he was not merely a defeated foe, but the symbol of a foreign arrogance that thought it could buy the world. The invasion had been unjustified, driven purely by greed, and so his punishment had to carry meaning. Sharena ordered a public ceremony. Before a gathering of nobles and captured Romans, a cauldron of gold was heated until it turned molten. The very metal that had defined Crassus's power and pride throughout his life would now serve as the instrument of his. Crassus was forced to kneel. He tried to speak, perhaps to plead, perhaps to protest, but his captors held his head firmly. The air shimmered with heat, and silence fell again. When the molten gold began to flow, the soldiers gripped his jaw and poured the burning liquid into his mouth. The sound was indescribable. The molten metal scorched his flesh, his chest, his throat, until the richest man in Rome was silent forever. His death was horrific, but the symbolism was unmistakable. The man who lived for wealth died suffocated. To the Parthians, it was poetic justice. To the Romans, it was unimaginable humiliation. When the news reached Rome, the impact was devastating. An empire accustomed to victory now faced a defeat that went far beyond the battlefield. They had not only lost an army, they had lost the myth of invincibility. The death of Crassus marked the end of the Triumvirate that had ruled Rome alongside Caesar and Pompey. Without him, the balance of power collapsed, and the road to civil war lay open. Sharena had achieved far more than a military triumph. He had turned Roman arrogance into an eternal lesson. Crassus, who sought to be remembered as a hero, became the ultimate warning of what happens when gold blinds reason and pride replaces wisdom. The desert swallowed him, and history turned him into a cautionary tale. The man who wanted everything ended with nothing. No army, no honor, no voice. Rome had always taken pride in its invincibility. For centuries, its armies had marched across continents, defeated kings, conquered empires, and raised its banner over entire nations. The belief in Roman superiority ran so deep that many thought the gods themselves had destined the people of Rome to rule the world. But when news arrived from distant Mesopotamia, that myth began to crumble. The richest man in Rome, Marcus Licinius Crassus, was dead, and not in glory, but in disgrace, defeated by an eastern enemy, humiliated, and executed in a cruel fashion. His army, one of the most powerful Rome had ever sent, was annihilated in the desert. Not a single legion returned intact. It was the first time in generations that Rome had suffered a catastrophe of such magnitude. The defeat of Crassus was not just a military tragedy. It was a psychological and political wound at the very heart of the Republic. The capital, accustomed to celebrating triumphs, was now forced to face the silence of shame. The streets of Rome, so often filled with the cheers of victorious generals, fell mute. Senators searched for words to justify the disaster, but no one could explain how an empire that believed itself invincible had been destroyed by Parthian horsemen in the middle of the desert. The myth of Rome's absolute power was beginning to crack, and with it, the delicate political balance that held the Republic together began to fracture as well. The First Triumvirate, that alliance of giants uniting Julius Caesar, Pompey the Great, and Crassus, had been built on convenience and mutual. Each man embodied a different form of power. Caesar, the populist military genius; Pompey, the Senate's favored hero; and Crassus, the financier whose vast wealth funded the ambitions of the other two. His death did not simply remove an ally. It destroyed the balance that kept them from turning on each other. Without Crassus, the triumvirate became a table with only two legs, unstable and ready to collapse. Caesar was at the height of his Gallic victory, adored by the people and feared by the conservative elite. Pompey, meanwhile, drew closer to the Senate, seeking to restore his image as the defender of order. Between them, rivalry festered. Crassus had been the buffer, the weight that kept the scales even. His gold, his pragmatism, his influence had kept peace between two titans. But now, without him, Rome was left divided between two men who each wanted everything. The power vacuum his death created would not be filled by diplomacy, but by ambition. The disaster in Parthia had exposed an uncomfortable truth. Rome was not invincible, and if the empire could fall to foreign hands, what would stop it from collapsing under its own? That question haunted the Senate and flamed the speeches of politicians. Pompey saw in Caesar a growing threat, a general whose fame and legions made him too powerful. Caesar, in turn, saw in Pompey a traitor, a man aligning himself with the aristocracy to curtail his rise. Between them, trust no longer existed, only fear. And in Rome, fear had always been the herald of war. With Crassus dead, rumors spread like wildfire. Rome has lost its soul. The Senate began to pressure Caesar to give up his command. Pompey was declared protector of the Republic. Caesar, refusing to submit, marched his legions back toward Italy. The decisive moment came when he crossed the Rubicon River, a gesture that symbolized the beginning of civil war. By crossing that river, Caesar knew there was no turning back, and in a way, it had all begun in the desert of Carrhae, with the death of Crassus. Parthia had won a single battle, but its true victory was planting the seed of destruction within Rome itself. The death of the Republic's richest man shattered the fragile alliance that upheld Roman power and plunged the state into chaos. The civil war that followed was brutal, fratricidal, and inevitable. Caesar and Pompey, former allies, became mortal enemies. The blood spilled on the sands of Mesopotamia seemed to echo through the streets of Rome. Each legion that turned its sword against another was a living reminder of the arrogance that had begun with one man's greed. In the end, the Roman Republic was not destroyed by a foreign enemy, but by its own leader. The defeat of Crassus revealed that no empire is eternal, and that hubris is always the first step toward ruin. When Caesar triumphed and declared himself dictator for life, the Republic's fate was sealed. The Roman ideal of shared governance died along with the last remnant of balance that had sustained it. Crassus's lust for gold had lit the spark, and that spark consumed an heir. From that moment on, Rome would cease to be a republic of citizens and would become the empire of one man. The tragedy of Crassus, the rivalry of Caesar and Pompey, and the war that followed marked the end of one age and the birth of another, a Rome that would never be the same again. Some stories survive through time, not because of the battles they tell, but because of the lessons they leave. The story of Marcus Licinius Crassus is one of them, a man who possessed everything the world could offer: wealth, influence, power, and yet wanted more. His life is proof that ambition, when it crosses the boundary of reason, turns into poison. Crassus believed he could buy glory, that gold could open the doors of eternity, and for a while, it seemed he was right. No one in Rome was richer, more influential, or more feared. He financed political campaigns, bought loyalty, and shaped decision. But what he failed to realize was that the more gold he amassed, the poorer his soul became. When he decided to conquer Parthia, he did not do it for Rome, nor out of duty. He did it out of vanity. He wanted to prove to the world and to himself that he could be as great as Caesar and Pompey. Deep down, he didn't want to defeat an enemy. He wanted to defeat his own ego, and that was exactly what destroyed him. Crassus's ambition blinded him to the sign, made him ignore advice, despise caution, and challenge fate itself. He marched confidently into the desert, believing that fortune would protect him, that gold would buy victory. But the desert accepts no bribes. There, he discovered what many only realized too late. There are things money cannot buy: wisdom, loyalty, and destiny. His defeat was not only military, but moral. When molten gold was poured down his throat, the punishment was not merely physical, it was symbolic. The metal that had sustained him throughout his life became the instrument of his ruin. It was as if the universe itself, weary of his arrogance, had decided to show him the true weight of what he loved most. The story of Crassus is more than an ancient account. It is a mirror, because in every era, there are men and women who lose themselves in the pursuit of more power, more success, more wealth. The lesson is clear, but rarely learned. Ambition, when guided by wisdom, can move mountains. But when guided by vanity, it destroys empire. Crassus lived to accumulate and ended up empty. He wanted to be remembered as a hero, but was remembered as a warning. His brutal death echoed not only through Rome, but across the centuries, reminding us that glory bought with gold is always fragile. Greatness is not born from wealth, but from character. And in the end, the richest people are those who know when they already have enough. If we look closely, the fall of Crassus is not merely an ancient tragedy. It is a metaphor for humanity itself. The modern world is still full of Crassuses, people who confuse worth with price, who believe that success justifies everything. But his story proves the opposite. True victory lies not in conquering the world, but in not losing oneself with gold. Can shine, but it can also blind. And when it blinds, it turns dreams into damnation. That is why, 2,000 years later, we still speak of him, because as long as there are those willing to sacrifice everything for power, the silent voice of Crassus will continue to echo from the depths of history, reminding us that the line between triumph and tragedy is often nothing more than a single choice made out of pride. And so, we reach the end of the story of Marcus Licinius Crassus, the richest man in Rome, the conqueror who lost everything because he wanted too much, a life that began with gold and ended with fire. And perhaps that's why this story still fascinates, because it speaks less about empires and more about ourselves. Each of us carries a little of that same ambition, that desire to prove something to the world. But as Crassus learned in the hardest way possible, when desire surpasses reason, the price is always too high. This story reminds us that true power lies in the wisdom to recognize when enough is enough, to know when to stop before gold turns into a curse. If you've made it this far, my friend, it means this story captivated, and I want to thank you. But before we wrap up, let me ask you a small favor. Subscribe to the channel and leave your like. It's more important than it seems. When you subscribe and click like, YouTube understands that this kind of historical and narrative content is worth showing to more people. That's how the algorithm works. It needs to see that you care, so it can share the video with others who also love history and deep reflections like so. If you want to keep watching stories that blend emotion and knowledge, hit the subscribe button and turn on the notification bell. And of course, tell me in the comments what you thought about the story of Crassus. Do you think he was a victim of his own greed or of fate? Which part impressed you the most? I love reading your thoughts. That's where our conversation continues to live. Now, before you go, take a look at the video that's appearing on your screen right now. I promise, it's even more fascinating and captivating than this one. In it, we'll explore another incredible story, full of twists and lessons that will leave you reflecting for days. So, click there, dive with me into the next journey, and I'll see you